Hi, welcome to the Live Performance Australia Julie's Bicycle Energy Efficiency webinar for production and touring. The webinar tonight is hosted by Live Performance Australia. We thank Suzanne Daly, who is the Director of Policy and Programs and is also the Project Manager for the Greener Life Performances through Energy Efficiency Project. We welcome Alison Tickell, who is the CEO of Julie's Bicycle, as well as Luke Ramsey from Julie's Bicycle, who will be helping me present tonight. My name is Lisa Erhardt. I'm a project partner on the Greener Life Performances project, and we welcome you.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'd like to hand over to Alison Tickell to say a few words and a hello from Julie's Bicycle.
Hi everybody, thanks very much for that, Lisa, and thanks everybody else for being here. So my name is Alison Tickell, as Lisa said, and we thought we'd just start this with a few words about our partnership with Live Performance Australia first, and then a little bit about why we feel it's so important that the cultural sector engages with the issues around climate change and around managing from our own points of view, and why the EEG tools and measuring is so critical to us. So the first thing is just a little about our partnership, which grew out of a commitment and a passion from Live Performance Australia to deal with climate change and environmental impacts from a domestic point of view, which happily coincided with a couple of trips that I took, wonderful trips to Australia, and realised when I was travelling around that there was a huge appetite in Australia from the cultural sector to engage with the issues of climate change and environmental impacts, and some really interesting and very different from the UK, some very interesting constraints, particularly around the distances that you all have between big cities and how you actually work together as a community. And so after some really interesting discussions and insights with Live Performance Australia, we realized that actually having the tools, so developing a common set of environmental metrics and carbon literacy was going to be a really effective way potentially of you building yourselves as a community around environmental literacy. It's also absolutely true that the cultural sector is much bigger than that, bounded by our national boundaries, and one of the aspirations that Live Performance Australia shares with Julie's Bicycle is an aspiration that as a cultural sector we work on this issue internationally. So we now have a really positive relationship with you guys, which consists of licensing the creative industry green tools to you, which we're going to talk about in some depth a bit later on, but also sharing good practice and understanding what the differences and what the constraints, but also crucially what the opportunities are to work together and at scale. So just a quick top line on what Julie's Bicycle has been doing, and a bigger sort of international story. So we've been around for 7 years, as many of you will know, and during that time it's been really heartening to see the gradual growth in interest and international action by doing, not just by talking about, but actually by really understanding creative practice and implementing on the ground measures that are going to make a difference. So we now have the EEG tools, which you were our first licensee, which was terribly exciting to all of us. Been joined by Scotland. We've got a very big license with the Arts Council in England, where environmental reporting is a condition of funding. And we now have the tools translated into 7 European languages, and are discussing licensing in the USA and possibly in China too. And of course, what this gives us is this extraordinarily interesting snapshot into how we are working as an international community. And we really hope that with your input and with this international input, we can start to hothouse what are really good ideas that will work way over and above the measuring of environmental impacts to really start to implement low carbon practice right across the world. The other thing that we've managed to do, and we really hope that at some point, once we've got some critical mass in Australia, we'll be able to support the LPA to do, is to develop benchmarks. So in the UK, we've got a set of benchmarks, some for buildings and some for festivals, which allow organisations to understand their practice and their performance in relation to others. And this has been a great, a hugely helpful thing for many organisations in the UK. It allows them to understand where they sit in relation to their peers and to strive for improvements. And it also allows us to understand just how much money can be saved through efficiencies. So the more we have traction with the creative industry green tools in Australia, the more you will get out of them, not just in terms of your own personal operations, but also in terms of your performance in relation to others. And just one other final point before I go, just to say that the other Australian organisation actually that we've been having a really productive relationship, which is something called the International Federation of Arts Councils and Culture Agencies, which is based in Australia, and it represents the big arts councils membership body, if you like. And Ithaca have been watching the work that we've been doing alongside the work that the LPA and others have been doing with great interest. We now have just produced a report, which I will send to Lisa, who can forward to anybody who's interested, looking at what environmental action at scale really looks like. And this is feeding already into the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals that UNESCO is fronting. And the reason for mentioning that is just to say that more and more it's becoming clear that as we move towards more climate negotiations, that environmental impact measurement and proactive responses to environmental sustainability is going to become not just more urgent in terms of our climate, but also in terms of our transparency, our accountability, and what is expected of us by civic society. So I think being on the front foot, which the LPA absolutely is only going to be a great thing. And it is also the most inspiring, exciting journey I think that any of us can take in our lives. So that's all from me. Just thank you so much for being part of this really, really exciting journey. And the work that you're doing is absolutely critical. It's a very positive contribution. And I think as we move forward, we can build this international community of voluntary action and really make a difference. So thanks very much, and it's extremely exciting that you're all engaged in this with us. Thanks very much, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Alison. You know, we're of course extremely grateful for the support that Julie's Bicycle offer us. So thank you so much for taking the time to stop and say hello this morning. I know that you've got a lot on, so thank you, and we'll talk soon.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so from let's now just sort of start looking at the slides. Live Performance Australia and Julie's Bicycle, as you've just heard from Alison, are really committed to providing some really thoughtful leadership and inspiration, because of course we're wanting to move towards a more sustainable and culturally creative future. We're asking industry to participate in programs that are challenging. They're challenging the industry norms that are out there, and we're asking you to participate in things that you wouldn't normally embark upon. Things like capturing data and reporting of energy consumption information, things like creating energy efficiency policies and, of course, creating checklists to ensure that all that can be done towards a more energy efficient future is being done. As Alison mentioned before, we're working towards creating benchmarking data in Australia so that there is some type of comparison for industry to then determine whether in fact they are performing at an average standard, at an excellent standard, or whether in fact there's quite a bit that needs to be done. So we're asking people, of course, to participate in these programs, and it's different, it's strange. We appreciate that. But of course, the key question that we're here to ask ourselves is, why is it important that we take action? You may or may not have seen press releases or information about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They released their 5th assessment report this year, and basically information from that is suggesting that global temperatures will continue to increase. Water cycles will change. Oceans will continue to warm. Arctic sea ice is likely to decrease. So it then poses the question, well, how does that impact Australia, and why are reports like this important for us to actually take note? And it could be things like, well, okay, there's quite possibly more drought expected, and that impacts our food bowl. Groundwater changes, that impacts drinkable water. Again, that's not specifically related to the arts, but how then does that in some indirect way affect the work that you're producing and the tours that you're proposing to take? So we're encouraging people to really look at some of the larger, higher level stuff to then understand how you can then make some choices or changes that is, sympathetic and understanding that these things are an issue. A little quote, it's not about who's winning or who's losing in the era of integrated energy efficiency. It's all about the willingness to master something new, something foreign, but something extremely worthwhile in a bid to reverse the damage of the Industrial Revolution. Too often when I'm sort of travelling and talking to industry, I'm often confronted with, disappointment from people that I'm talking to. They're expecting that they need to have achieved so much more than what they have. And I guess this quote is just here to let you know that we're not expecting great things from people. We're just expecting that you identify what action you can take and then to move forward with that action. On a larger scale, some of the benefits of integrating energy efficiency into operations. So within Australia, a small 1% improvement per year would generate an additional $8 billion in GDP by 2020 and $26 billion by 2030. So that's significant benefits, significant improvements. What does a 1% improvement mean for your production company or your tour? Reduce costs. We appreciate that 1% doesn't seem like much, but that 1% can easily translate into increased productivity, which is greater than the incremental change. And then what does that mean in increased interest from funders, councils, your audience, or whoever else is interested and participating in working with you and getting work up and running. So this is a diagram that I've created just recently, because we've often spoken about the importance of senior management and the creation of overarching policy. And of course, and that's extremely important. But what we maybe haven't spoken about, and what we should, is the importance of middle management and how they are core to the business model, how they're so important then in integrating sustainable practices into those core activities that your company participates in. From that middle management section, they then have the opportunity to leverage, well, what do we have in capability that can be modified slightly and then become more sustainable? How can we actually generate or gain a sustainable competitive advantage? Where and what do we do in integrating sustainable strategic linkages back to that core business model? And as you can see, like each relationship area is an opportunity to integrate some innovative business solutions. And they don't need to be, flying to the moon and back as an amazing solution, but it can be something as simple as recognizing that you have a member of staff who is really interested in the sustainability journey and wants to take a lead. So leveraging that internal capability that you have and making the absolute most of it. I recognise that that's probably a little bit to get your head around. Again, if you've got some questions, pop them in the chat box and I'll answer them as best I can. If we don't get to it in this particular presentation, I can email everybody with a response. I realise that I'm sort of moving through the slides relatively quickly, and that's because I'd like to give Luke as much time as possible in working through the tool, because I think that's the most important part of this presentation. So I've included a couple of case studies here in the presentation for you, just to show you what is being achieved in industry. And so Sydney Opera House, of course, an iconic venue. They've improved their air conditioning efficiency by 10%. They've switched off sail lighting and been able to save 12 megawatt hours a year. 54% energy reduction in theatres, switching to energy efficient lights just in dressing rooms alone. Replacing of shower heads, reduced paper use, and they buy green energy annually. We're not expecting, companies to adopt all of those things. It is just an opportunity to share some of the good stuff that's happening out there. So After Miss Julie is a presentation that, is a production that was presented in the UK in 2012. So Young Vic achieved an overall reduction in their carbon emissions of 38%, which is pretty significant when compared to an average production, similar budget, similar size. I think the important thing to note with this is the entire cast, creative and technical teams, were involved from the first communication, and this is fundamental to the success of achieving reductions of that magnitude. This particular production was a pilot, and therefore they spent extra time in exploring sustainable production across all aspects, so including marketing and ticketing. So there's a link to the case study itself if you'd like further information. So as a tour, Lost Property Rules was presented by the Queensland Theatre Company earlier this year. They had a total of 20 performances across the season, and like After Miss Julie, they started having the conversation and made sure that sustainability was on the agenda from very early in the process. After sign-off by the artistic director, it then filtered out, cast and crew involved, and I guess they went through a process of deciding, what can we sacrifice to then achieve something that we feel then that we've been able to contribute a lighter footprint for this particular tour. So in the end, the total greenhouse gas emissions for that tour were only 1.7 tonne. So they did a wonderful job. They spent time researching what type of vehicles were available and chose what they felt was the lowest emissions producing van, which was a diesel van, and they transported cast and show freight together. So we calculated that this particular tour had reduced their emissions by approximately 41% when compared to a similar tour, similar size and similar distance. So again, if you've got any other questions about those case studies, happy to help you out with them. So right now I'm going to hand over to Luke Ramsey, who is the Environmental Sustainability Manager for Julie's Bicycle, and he's going to take us through some of the new and wonderful changes of the ink tool. So Luke, I'll just hand over to you. Luke? Oh.
Okay, yeah, just had to unmute myself. Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderful.
Yeah, great, marvellous. Yeah, I'm Luke Ramsey, and I'm the Environmental Sustainability Manager at Julie's Bicycle. So that means I do various things, but one of the things I do is manage the tools and the development of the tools. So without further ado, we'll get on with the presentation. First of all, to kind of help everyone understand the importance of monitoring and measuring, i.e. using the tools, I thought I'd do a few slides about monitoring and measuring and action planning, but we'll whiz through those probably. So this first slide is kind of demonstrating how energy efficiency works, usually in buildings, but really the principles are applicable to any kind of environmental action. That is that between 20 and 30% of reductions in environmental impacts are often realized through changes in management or procedures. So this is the kind of low cost to no cost stuff. So this is really good news for anyone wanting to reduce their environmental impact. The first place you should stop at along the way is monitoring and measuring. It's important for a myriad of reasons, but especially that a lot of the time it's the action which actually realizes the biggest reduction. After that, organizations then start to consider technological solutions, big investments that might be upgrading the plant in a building, using on-site renewable energy, these kind of things. The paybacks become longer, and obviously the costs are a lot greater, and the returns sometimes are less than through basic management. So the point is really that it's very important to establish a baseline and understand what your impacts are, so you know whether you're moving in the right direction and you know whether you're improving or indeed actually getting worse. It's critical that you set a baseline. So what does data collection mean? I mean, it doesn't automatically equal understanding. You can see this is quite a disgusting spreadsheet, and people often mistake, I think, monitoring with a data collection exercise. So I think the first thing to do is to step back and ask yourself, what is it that you want to concentrate on, and how best am I going to most efficiently monitor the change there? So, for instance, in some cases, maybe you're looking at staff commuting in your organisation. A simple metric might be the number of staff using sustainable forms of transport to get to work, and that's fine. What might be a bit too heavy-handed is trying to understand how many miles each employee has travelled, how frequently, and it's sometimes better to kind of step back and think about what you're trying to monitor and manage, and how best to do that in a way that makes most sense to you. Now, there's lots of different impacts we can consider when we're thinking about monitoring and measuring. For your organisation, it might be a good idea to plot these out first and think about what you think intuitively might be the biggest impacts, and then you can go about setting a strategy for measuring them. So for instance, at first you might want to concentrate on your building, so you just concern yourself with monitoring energy consumption. But after a while you might decide that your action plan begins to incorporate actions to reduce the environmental impact of your audience travel. So at that point you might do a simple audience travel survey to find out, again, basically the proportion of audience members using sustainable forms of transport, and you might also ask a question about their motivations and why they use that form of transport, what was stopping them using another. These kind of smarter ways of collecting information that help inform action a bit better. Then obviously these can begin to translate into interactions once you've understood the magnitude of these different impacts and activities. A lot of impacts that you measure can be split into what you can control and what you can influence. So it's a great place to start in the middle with what you can control. That's what you're going to be able to realize the biggest difference on often. But for arts organizations especially, it's the impacts that you can influence which might potentially have the biggest effect. So for instance, audience travel for outdoor events can often be up to 80 or even 90% of the overall carbon emissions associated with the event. So it's a big impact, and it's something you can only really influence, maybe control to a greater or lesser extent. But it's definitely something to consider, and this is the crucial thing for arts organisations. You're able to influence an audience which is much bigger than your own footprint. So it's the conversations, it's the advocacy you're having with audience members. It's even the advocacy you're having if you're a touring organisation with the venues you visit when you speak to them about potentially things like green riders. So that might be a set of requirements that you're asking that an organisation meets when you come to visit them as a touring organisation. So you might be asking that they have an environmental policy in place, that they have sourced their food predominantly from a vegetarian kind of menu to reduce the environmental impact from that. You might ask that they have an action plan in place to ensure that energy efficiency is maintained through the building. The answer to a lot of these questions from them might be, no, we don't do that. But the fact that you've asked the question is the crucial thing, because it's showing a commitment and demand from the sector, and for some people, if that then becomes a business case, then so be it. It's still having the same effect. So it's definitely a big part of what arts organisations can do is the influencing and the advocacy, although it doesn't feel as tangible. To start making some action, it's great to have a policy in place, first of all. A policy is an overarching statement which basically commits you to taking action on environmental sustainability. It should be an honest document, so you should be being sincere about the actions you can take, and being a bit ambitious, but not ridiculously ambitious with what you want to achieve, and being transparent about it, so saying what you are going to take action on and what, frankly, you can't take action on at this point. That's much better than a document that is a bit shallow and is just kind of referring to points because it's an environmental policy. It should actually be meaningful to the organisation. It shouldn't just go into a desk drawer somewhere. And once you've got that overarching policy and commitment, you can begin to build some actions around it. And So different organizations approach this in different ways. You might decide to integrate some responsibility into employees' job roles. You might, in the instance of monitoring and measuring, decide to do an audience survey or purchase some equipment which helps you understand your energy consumption you're building on a half-hourly basis, for example. And you might also want to think of the scope of these actions. So do you want to just focus on the low-hanging fruit first, or are you looking a bit more ambitiously and looking at some of the strategic investments that we were looking on at the graph on one of the first slides? There's lots and lots of resources to help you do this as well, which I'm sure Lisa can kind of go through at the end of the presentation, perhaps just quickly highlighting some of the resources available through Live Performance Australia. I think also it's important to make sure any actions you've set for yourself are smart. So that is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic and time-bound. So just making sure they tick all of those points so that you've actually got an action that means something, that someone is responsible for, and that you can actually measure whether or not you've achieved it or not. So we will now move on to the tool.
Any questions at
Okay.
this? Oh, sorry. No, keep going. Oh, just I was going to ask
Okay.
any questions at this stage, or we right to keep moving? All good. We'll keep moving.
Okay, great. So these are the LPA IG tools. If you're not already part of the IG tools, you can just go to lpa.ig-tools.com and you'll be able to sign up. The tools are free for organizations to use, and they're specific to Australia, so some of the conversion factors which we use to convert your information into carbon emissions have been tailored to Australia to reflect that, and some of the advice has too. So when organizations log on to the tools, you'll first see this reports dashboard. So basically the report dashboard summarizes the reports that you've created to quantify your environmental impact. There's 5 different tools which exist on the IG tools, and you can quantify your environmental impact through what we term as reports. So if I was setting up a new report, I would just click this link at the bottom, and you'll see that we've got a selection of 5 different tool types to select from to quantify our environmental impact. So obviously, tools and production will probably be the most relevant to people during this webinar, but I will also touch on the venues and cultural building tool too. So ordinarily you would create a new report. I've already created a few reports here to demonstrate the tools. So I'll just first of all show you what a report would look like for a venue. So what you should do when you want to look into the report is to click the report. Now, organizations, we would expect them to submit data usually on an annual basis for a building, and they would input this in entries. So you can see how this is catalogued here. And selecting any of these entries helps us to begin to analyze them. So when we select that information, it begins to show up on the dashboard to the right-hand side, which is a table which shows the overall emissions. So we can see that our overall emissions is just over 500 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And we can also see how those emissions have changed since the last year. So it's looking at the difference between those 2 entries. We can download all of this data in result form, which is kind of summarized, or we can download the entry data, which is kind of more of a raw export from the database. Some of the other things we can do is analyze this data with a pie chart. It doesn't look very interesting at the moment because we haven't brought any other impacts, but if you select those impacts, they're broken up into their constituents, so you can see how much of our emissions for this particular building are made up of electricity versus gas, for example. And we can compare year-to-year performance too, using the bar chart feature. So I think first of all, we'll go into one of these entries and we'll select the entry relating to our tour that we've set up. So if I click that report, all I need to do to go into the entry I've already created is edit entry. And the tools are basically set up in a list of tabs where you input some information, and that information is either quantified into carbon dioxide emissions, or it's used to contextualize some of those emissions in terms of performances, for example. So you can understand how they relate to the intensity of your cultural activity. So we can begin to put some information about the number of performances that we have done during the tour, how many performances related to promotional activity, for example, or what were the scale of the indoor performances that happened, were there any outdoor performances? So we can begin to populate that. At the moment, I've just got 10 performances for large and medium and 50 small indoor performances. We can then input the information about the accommodation used during the tour. So this is an interesting point to look at. Accommodation which is used through friends or in rented accommodation is going to be about a third lower than using a hotel room night. So playing around with these numbers will help you understand some of the reductions you can make in your environmental impact by making these decisions. If you ever want to put any other additional notes that relate to your data, then you can put them in at the bottom of every tab. And you'll notice also that each of the fields has some help text next to the side of it to help you understand what we're actually asking you to input. Now, personnel travel, this is going to be one of the usually one of the bigger impacts of a tour, and we've covered most kind of conceivable vehicles for this particular tour, for most tours for you to cover here. So you can see that we've got, for example, even ferries, domestic flights, and what some organisations do is sum up the information and input it as a total distance. But if it's easy for you to organise, you can click this plus button at the side, and this will produce additional lines for you to input information on. Now again, the help text should help you understand what we're asking to input at different points. The main thing to understand here is the slight difference between using vehicle kilometres and passenger kilometres. So most of what we're asking here is vehicle kilometres. So if you think about it, if you drive a car from A to B, whether it has 1 passenger or 4 passengers in, roughly it's going to use the same amount of fuel. The difference in efficiency comes from making sure that 4 people are able to benefit from that single journey than 1. So the amount of passengers isn't factored in to something like a car journey, whereas the bus is based on passenger kilometres, and therefore it's important that we put in the number of people as well as the distance travelled. So that's the one thing to look out for some of these factors. That's the same for trains too. If you do need any clarity on that, then you can always get in touch with us or with Live Performance Australia to know exactly. So in this example here, we have a return distance of 1,600 miles for long-haul flights, and there's 50 economy passengers using that flight. So it's essentially 50 passengers times that distance. What we wouldn't do here is multiply the 50 by the 1,600 and then still put in 50 passengers. Every time you've input some information, you can just kind of save and update results button, and that will recalculate your carbon emissions to be adapted to the information that you've just put in. On the production tab, this is where we can input some information about the show power that's been involved in the particular production, if you know that information. We can also input information which relates to our freighting. So whether that's trucking freight, air freight, sea freight, we can input this, and again we can input it on additional lines. So for example, we might put in that we had 5,000 kilometers of 2 tons on sea ferry and save and update results there. And finally, we have a tab here where you can talk about some of the innovation that you've been doing in your organization to reduce your environmental impacts. This, when it's used well, is really interesting, because this is hopefully what the tools is all about further down the line, is sharing best practice, talking about what you're doing so other organizations can learn from that. So if there's anything that helps us understand how you've made some reductions in environmental impact, that's great. You can shout about it here. Now inside the entry, we also have a results screen, and on the results screen there's a kind of helpful tab here to show if we've missed any information out that might be important to help calculating the carbon emissions. I've just missed out the toll name here, which isn't too critical. And then we have some of our results shown here. Now we can also split this by performance, so a relative metric that helps us understand how many emissions are being produced for each of the performances. If we click on some of these, we can see that, for instance, here the hotels in the accommodation was more impactful than using the friends and the rented accommodation. We can also split out any of these tabs to see where the emissions are being produced from. And again, you can download all of these results as a CSV file for you to use on Excel, and you can also display this information in a pie chart. So this is kind of getting back to that point I was describing earlier, which is beginning to prioritize some action. So you can look at your environmental impacts and make an informed decision about where you might begin to look. In this particular example, I've put quite a lot of freight in there, and that happens to be a lot of air freight. So if this was a real example, this is an obvious place to start addressing some action. You might want to begin to look at what the difference would be if the equivalent was taken by a land alternative, for example. So you might look at transferring some of that distance to a truck, for example, or to sea ferry, for example. So what would be the difference if, and we'll add those miles in, if that had changed to we'll put the 7 in here. So it's about 107 tons now, and we can save and update that. So that's reduced quite significantly there, because we've transferred some of the freighting across to sea freight. So you can now see that the personnel travel is beginning to be a bigger proportion of our impact, and that might be an area that we then begin to focus on. Now, if you once you've inputted any information into the tools, one of the great features on here is the Submit Results for Review button. So if you click that, that will send an email off to to LPA and Julie's Bicycle. And that will mean someone can sense check your data and also give you recommendations about what you might want to focus on next. So that's a really useful resource to flag there. So when we're in any entry, to get back out of it, we just need to click the Back to Reports Overview tab. So link, sorry, and we'll click that. So I'm back out to the screen where I start when I log in now. And you can see that all of these reports expand and collapse when I click on them. So I'll click on our Wheels of Fortune production, and we can have a look at some of the information stored in there. So again, I've just clicked on the report, and I just need to click the button for Edit. Again, just like the other tools on the IG tools, there's a General tab which inputs some information to help contextualize some of the data that we've inputted further down the line. So this even goes into the budget used for the production, how long it's on for, how many days the rehearsals are, how many performances there are, what's the average length of each show. Now, the production tool is particularly interesting because it differs slightly to the other tools on the IG tools. It looks at resources of the sets that you might be constructing, and it looks at what you're doing with those resources afterwards. So it's really, really good for kind of systematically thinking about where you're sourcing some of these materials from, first of all, and then secondly, where they end up. So we've got different options for different types of timber here, what type they are and where they're sourced from, and you can input the size and the quantity used. And then we ask how much of this goes to landfill, how much has been recycled. And for steel, we can also address how much has been used and what happens to it afterwards. What a lot of organizations use this tool for is scenario planning, and the same is true for tours too. Some organizations might input some information and then say, well, what if we changed our recycling rate to from 80% landfill to 20% landfill and 80% recycled? So it's about 6.3 tons of CO2 at the moment. And if that ratio was changed, for instance, against the wood that we've used, then if we click Save and Update Results, we can see that that's gone down by about a ton. So it's an important thing to think about, and it's allowing you some facts to base your actions on. So we've just had a question about if we had a production that tours, would we use both the touring and the production tool? Yes, you use both tools. They address quite different impacts. The production tool looks specifically at what is happening on stage. So that's the lighting, that's the sound, that's the materials used in the production, but it's exclusively looking at that. It's not looking at anything else that's happening in the building. And the touring tool is looking essentially at the transportation used to move both the sets and the people of that production. They're not combined into the same tool because they're quite different things. But what you can absolutely do is aggregate the numbers and analyze them together as one on a bar chart and a pie chart feature, which I'll show you after this demonstration, so you can understand how their impacts relate to one another. And again, we've got some examples of how we might change the lighting and sound rig of our performance. So at the moment, this is some tungsten lighting that I've inputted here, but we might want to change it to the equivalent of what it would be for LEDs, for example. So we would change that to 2.73. And if we save and update those results, you'll see that our impact for the production has now gone down significantly by about 4 tons. So you can see that this is really, really useful at sitting down and understanding what is the difference between some of the decisions you might have to be making for a production. The tools are pretty intuitive. You can see that most of the time the descriptions work for the features, and you can, for instance, on this tab, you can change the percentage of how long the light is on for the show. You can adjust how long the lights are dimmed for during the show. So all of these factors are going to change your impact, and you can even put in the rating of your sound system too. Again, just like the other tools, this tool has an innovation tab where you'll be able to speak about some of the things you're doing to reduce your environmental impact. And again, we've got a pie chart which helps you understand where your impacts are coming from. So I'll go back to reports overview now. And what we can also do with the tools is select multiple entries of data to compare them side by side. So we might want to select our tour, our production, and the last year of our annual emissions for our venue. And if we summarize that as a pie chart, we can see what all of those impacts look like together. Here, because we've got the venue included, we can see the energy is quite large, so we might decide to take that out and look at the pie chart again. So this is our tour and our production combined. You can see that at the moment, with the data that we've inputted, it's predominantly the freight travel and the personnel travel from the tour itself, which is the biggest impact, with the materials, light and sound, and even accommodation all being quite a small proportion of the impact. So I'm sure in your case it'd be really interesting to input the information and see how these two things stack up against each other. And one thing to mention about the production impacts, which are coming up as being quite small here, is because the production tool is exclusively looking at what is happening on the stage. So what's happening with the lighting, the sound, and the materials. What it obviously isn't taking into account is also the energy used within the venue to keep the audience cool, to ventilate the air in that room. So that's another consideration that can be made as well during the performance that isn't necessarily going to be highlighted on this pie chart. And we can also analyze them in terms of bars next to each other, so we can really see the magnitude. So on the left-hand side, we've got the production versus the impacts of the tour. And on these bar charts, we can also decide to filter certain impacts out, so we can focus on, for example, the accommodation of the tour versus the light and sound and materials of our production. All of these bar charts are also downloadable, so you can download them as JPEGs or PDFs to be included in reports. You can also do these by different metrics, so per performance or per staff member or per £1,000 of budget, and this is where the information that you put in a general tab enriches the analysis that you can do further down the line. Now I'll also show you how you would input a new a new entry of data. So we just click on add an entry. If we want to add another data entry to our existing tour report, we just do that by clicking Add Entry underneath that report. We'd specify the date range of that tour and click Create Entry. And you can see that brings us into a new entry where we can input the relevant information for that particular leg of the tour, for example. And if I click back to Reports Overview, you can see that now we have 2 entries for our tour report. So you can see that we're beginning to catalog different entries of data based on perhaps different tour legs or even different scenarios that we're planning. So just a question from Lisa: if we had an average energy consumption rating for a typical venue of a typical size, we could input that into the venue tab. Yes, we could do. So we might be able to input the energy consumption typically of in a venue during a performance that's dealing with the heating and the cooling. We could input that information as well, so you could understand how that sits. But again, it kind of comes back to control and influence. So if you're responsible for the production, then the chances are it is the lighting, possibly, maybe the sound, and probably the materials that you're going to be in control of, and that's the things that you can change. The heating and the cooling infrastructure in a building that you're visiting for that production is something you're going to be able to less have control over. So sometimes we often, yeah, kind of going back to the original point, we'd ask organisations to concentrate on what they can control first of all. If we look at the Touring Tool 2, you'll also see that at the moment we have some benchmarks to show what some per performance emissions would look like for typical tours. Now this is UK emissions for the music sector, but it's interesting to begin to compare some of the features. Now we're going to be able to make this feature dynamic once there is some data from the LPA research. We're going to be able to input a benchmark feature to be able to compare yourself graphically against the industry average. Just to give you a sense of what this looks like, we've already got this in place for venues and cultural buildings. I'm just using this as an example to show you how you might benchmark, and this feature will be available hopefully further down the line as we get some benchmarks in for touring from LPA. If you click on the benchmarking feature, you'll see we've got in the kind of orange, we've got the benchmark value. So this is the average for the industry in the UK. Quite high gas consumption there, but that's because it's a little chillier over here. And we've got that venue's consumption next to it. So you can really begin to see straight away how your performance relates to the industry average. So for this particular venue, the gas consumption looks very on par with what we'd expect for a venue of that size, whereas the electricity consumption is slightly higher and the water consumption seems to be quite efficient. So that's a feature we're hopefully we'll be bringing on live pretty soon for tours too, to be able to help you understand what the emissions should typically look like per performance for things like travel, for things like accommodation. We just had a question about how do you calculate for multiple venues for one production? If you rehearse in one room, build the set and the wardrobe, and then the actual performance. Yeah, well, the production tool is looking at what it takes is the lighting and the sound rig for a performance. So as I was saying, because it focuses on what's happening on the stage and doesn't focus on the energy use elsewhere in the building, in a way, if you take the materials that you've used, if you take the lighting rig that you've got and the sound rig, then that will approximately have the same environmental impact whichever building it's functioning within. So if you're rehearsing in a different room to the one that you're performing in, with this particular lighting arrangement and sound arrangement, then the impacts are likely to be similar. That's why we ask for the number of days that the rehearsals are being held for. Of course, if the rehearsals are taking place using a different sound and lighting rig, then this wouldn't be applicable to this particular entry. And this is where, if you had a slightly different sound and lighting rig, you would create an additional entry for this production for what I've called Wheels of Fortune here. You would add in another entry. And you could specify the date range just for the rehearsal period, create that entry. So we might just rehearse. We can just put that in there and to let us know that it's rehearsal. And then we'll just specify the materials used for that rehearsal period, the lighting used for that rehearsal period. So we can then get an understanding of what the difference is between rehearsal impacts and those of the production itself when it took place in the venue that it was taking place in. In terms of the location where you were building a set, that's a bit more tricky because you would trying to be quantifying the energy consumption relating to that building for the specific time that you were in it. For a lot of set building places, we expect an organisation to manage that building all year round, and in that case you would use the venue and cultural building tool to account for the energy over a 12-month period, so you could see what that impact looks like. And then it would be a case of trying to manage the energy consumption all year round rather than just focusing on it for the set construction. Okay, so I'm aware that time has flown really fast, and we're just about 5 minutes over the scheduled length of the demonstration now. So if anyone has any specific questions that I might be able to help with, I guess it's a good time to ask now. So we've just had a question about, I noticed that answering yes, do you use a green tariff, didn't update the results. The green energy tariff, that's something we ask for only about in the venues and cultural building tool and the office tool, which we haven't shown here. We just ask for how much on-site renewable energy there is and how much green tariff electricity you use. At the moment, there isn't a functionality to zero rate that energy, but we are looking into seeing if green tariff electricity can be zero rated. It's quite complicated because technically speaking, green tariff electricity still isn't zero carbon electricity, but that's probably for another presentation. I'm more than happy to follow up with that afterwards. Okay, well, I hope that's given a fairly good overview of how the tools work. I'm more than happy to give some more advice after the webinar, if that helps as well. It's quite tricky sometimes to get your head around some of these things until you're beginning to use them, and that's when you understand them a little bit better and find out possibly how to break them as well. Just very, very quickly, some additional functionality we do have planned in the early new year is we'll be increasing the scope of some of the tools. So we'll be basically increasing the types of impacts you can account for in different tools. There'll be an indoor event tool And this will be a hybrid of our outdoor event tool, our cultural building tool. And this will fill the gap, which has kind of been talked about a little bit today in the presentation, which is how do we account for the energy for a specific event in a building that goes beyond what is just happening on stage. So that's really, really useful. We're going to have audit trail functionality, which I won't go into detail about now, but that will improve the data quality of everyone. And we'll have user-end reports. So basically, we'll have some reports which will summarize some of the analytical features we already have, like the tables, the pie charts, and the bar charts, into a single-page report. So that'll be a really, really useful communication tool, and it will help summarize your progress to date. So sorry if that was a bit of a whirlwind, but I'm aware of time, so I'll probably bow out at this point.
Thanks so much, Luke. That was great. That was great. So that kind of brings us to the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to hand over to Suzanne just to say a few words.
Thanks, Luke. That was incredibly useful. It was really good to go through the tool page by page and not only see how you can use it in a practical sense, but for an actual performance, but how you can use it to plan and sort of just, you know, sliding those scales up and down and changing variables. And before you even make any decisions about a production, I think, and seeing what difference that makes to the impacts is incredibly valuable. So yeah. I hope everyone got a lot out of it. I know that I did. I'm conscious of time, so the only thing that I wanted to say was that a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today in terms of starting conversations and communications, you know, with venues, perhaps when you're going in on productions, on tour, there are a number of resources that LPA has developed as part of this project that will help you with that. You know, sort of sample clauses that can go into venue hire contracts and checklists and things like that. It's just to get those dialogues going. So I'm really pleased to advise that we've upgraded our website. So if you go to greener.liveperformance.com.au, you can find all of our project resources. And slowly, as we do more of these webinars, we'll be uploading the recordings of those as well. So I encourage you, now that you've had a good look around the tool, to also have a good look around our website and see what resources are there that might be able to help you on your journey. I think, you know, this is a good time of year, that sort of December, January housekeeping time of the year, to think about what goals you might want to set for your organisation over the next 12 months and what things that you would like to do better next year, and put yourself on a path to improvement. So thank you very much to Luke and to Alison for your time, and to Lisa for pulling the webinar together. Thank you all for your attendance on the various time zones around Australia, and I look forward to speaking to you all by phone or email soon. And have a good evening or morning.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.